Welcome back to the deep dive. This time, we're going on a fascinating journey through all of your sources on European business and economics. It looks like you're really interested in exploring all the different unique ways that European countries are approaching these issues, and you've given us so much to work with. Conference proceedings, academic papers, you've even provided us with some insights into financial models. So are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Yeah, the thing that really stands out to me is the range of topics you're looking into. I mean, you want to look at everything from the really specific details of like cost accounting for military exercises to the broader concept of how we can make cities more sustainable.
Okay, well, let's start with that urban sustainability idea then. One of the sources you gave us talks about cities functioning as reproductive systems. And I have to admit, that's a pretty intriguing way to think about it.
It really is a fascinating concept. So this paper from the 2017 IDS conference proceedings argues that cities, much like living organisms, are constantly adapting and evolving. They go through these cycles of, producing, consuming, and renewing, constantly trying to find that balance between using resources and regenerating them.
So it's not just about building bigger and better, but about creating systems that are able to sustain themselves over time.
Exactly. And it really highlights how interconnected everything is within a city. You think about efficient transportation systems. They obviously move people, but they also have a big impact on air quality and economic productivity. It's really all intertwined.
Yeah, it makes you think about city planning in a whole new way. Instead of just focusing on individual buildings or neighborhoods, we need to consider the city as a whole, as a living, breathing organism.
Precisely. And, that brings us to another major player in the economic landscape. Small and medium enterprises, or SMEs. You included quite a bit of material on the role they're playing in Europe.
You're right. It seems like the EU is really putting a lot of effort into trying to help these smaller companies succeed. There's mention of a think small first principle. What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, the EU recognizes that SMEs are truly the backbone of so many economies in Europe. They drive innovation, create jobs, and contribute significantly to overall growth. The Think Small First principle basically encourages policymakers and big corporations to consider the impact of their decisions on these smaller companies to ensure they're not being held back by unnecessary red tape or unfair competition.
So it's about creating an environment where these smaller businesses can thrive and contribute to the larger economic ecosystem.
Exactly. Both Poland and the Czech Republic, as you point out in your sources, have really embraced this principle, with SMEs representing almost 99% of all businesses in both countries.
Wow, that's a huge percentage. But I imagine managing all of those businesses, especially as they grow and interact with different cultures, probably comes with its own set of challenges. And actually, there's a paper here on intercultural management in SMEs, particularly in places like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Ukraine. What really stood out to you there?
This paper delves into the concept of culture shock, which can really impact both employees and managers, especially in diverse workplaces. It's not simply about just being aware of different customs. It's about understanding how deeply ingrained cultural values can influence everything. Communication styles, problem-solving approaches, and even the way people perceive effective leadership.
So a manager from, say, Germany might approach a situation very differently from a manager from Ukraine, even if they both work for the same company.
Precisely. And failing to recognize those differences can lead to all kinds of problems. Misunderstandings, conflicts, and ultimately a less productive and harmonious work environment. This paper really stresses that successful intercultural management isn't just about tolerating differences. It's about actively leveraging those diverse perspectives to foster innovation and achieve better business outcomes.
That's a really interesting perspective. It's not just about trying to avoid conflict, but about harnessing those different viewpoints as a strength.
Exactly. Now, switching gears a bit, you also included some research that tries to link text analysis of online content to stock market trends. It seemed almost like science fiction to me when I first saw it, but it definitely piqued my interest. So what are they looking at here?
I know, right? Seems like they're trying to predict the future of companies just based on what people are saying online, on social media and stuff. To be honest, I'm a little bit skeptical, but we'll see what they have to say.
Well, they're not quite reading tea leaves, but it's close. This study uses these pretty sophisticated machine learning techniques to analyze massive amounts of online text, from news articles and social media posts to even those comment sections that we all love to hate. They're basically looking for patterns and shifts in overall sentiment that might be correlated with changes in a company's stock price.
So basically they're saying that what people are talking about online can actually give us clues about how a company is performing.
Yeah, That's the main idea. And while this research is still in its early stages, they found some pretty interesting correlations. They were actually able to predict stock price movements with an accuracy of, get this, 60 to 74%, which suggests it's not just random noise they're picking up on.
That's way higher than I expected. It makes you wonder if companies should be paying more attention to what's being said about them online, not just for marketing purposes, but also as a way to potentially spot early indicators of their financial performance.
Yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Now, you also provided some interesting papers on cost accounting, specifically in the context of military training exercises that they do in the Czech Republic.
Yes. I have to admit that seemed a little niche at first glance, but I'm curious, what can we, as people who are not in the military, actually learn from how the military approaches cost accounting?
Well, even though the context seems really specific, the principles that they're applying are actually quite universal. They're using methods like activity-based costing to break down the total cost of these training exercises, looking at everything, personnel and equipment, to those less obvious costs like command and administration overhead.
So it's about understanding all the hidden costs that go into any kind of activity, not just the most obvious ones.
Exactly. They're focusing on identifying what they call cost drivers. They're essentially the factors that have the biggest impact on overall costs. And you can apply this approach to, well, really any organization, whether you're running a small business, planning a project, or even just trying to manage your personal finances better.
So even though I'm probably not planning any military maneuvers in the near future, those cost accounting principles could still be useful for me.
Absolutely. It's all about really understanding where your money is going and then identifying those areas where you might be able to reduce costs or just improve efficiency. Now, speaking of financial pressures, let's turn our attention to Russia. You included a paper that examines the impact of oil price shocks on the Russian economy, which feels especially relevant given the current global situation.
It does, doesn't it? I remember reading that Russia shifted to a floating exchange rate back in 2014. So I'm curious how that decision has actually played out, especially with all of the volatility that we're seeing in the oil market these days.
Well, this paper uses a model called VAR, which stands for vector autoregression, to analyze that exact question. And it's interesting because they found that Russia's economy actually became more stable after they made that switch to a floating exchange rate. They compared it to the period between 2012 and 2014 when Russia was using what they called an interim exchange rate regime. And it seems like the central bank's attempts to kind of control the ruble's value back then actually ended up causing more problems.
So letting the market decide the value of the ruble rather than trying to control it turned out to be a better strategy in the long run.
That seems to be the case, especially when you're dealing with these external shocks like those fluctuating oil prices. The researchers argue that having a floating exchange rate basically acted as a shock absorber, which allowed the Russian economy to adjust more smoothly to the inevitable changes in the global market.
That's really fascinating. It reminds you that sometimes the best approach is to just step back and let the market run its course, rather than trying to control it too much.
Precisely. And, speaking of market forces, let's move on to something a little closer to home. Shopping. You included a study on visual merchandising and how it influences consumer behavior.
Ah, yes, the very subtle art of getting us to spend our hard-earned money. I have a feeling we're all influenced by this, whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. You're right. This study specifically focuses on a Polish clothing company called LPP and really gets into the psychology behind those beautiful displays and strategically placed sale racks. It's all about crafting that perfect shopping experience that entices customers to buy.
So it's more than just about just having nice clothes on display. It's really about the entire atmosphere of the store.
Exactly. They talk about things like, manipulating the lighting and even the music to create a specific mood, even controlling the temperature to make shoppers feel more comfortable and therefore more likely to stick around and browse and hopefully spend money.
Wow. I've never really thought about it that deeply. So maybe the next time I see a big sale rack, I should stop and think about whether it's a genuine bargain or just some clever psychological trick.
Yeah, perhaps. It's definitely food for thought. Now, shifting gears again, we come to a topic that's, well, always relevant. Debt. You have a source focusing on debt levels in those Visegrad Group countries. Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. What's the overall picture there?
Well, from what I remember, it wasn't exactly a pretty picture. It seems like these countries have been having to deal with some serious debt challenges, especially after that 2010 global financial crisis.
You're right. The research paints a somewhat concerning picture. All four countries have struggled with those budget deficits during the time period they analyzed, especially during that crisis. And while they've managed to improve their fiscal situations somewhat since then, they've all seen their government debt go up significantly compared to before the crisis. And Hungary, in particular, has actually exceeded what's considered a sustainable level of debt.
So debt seems to be a recurring problem for these countries. What are some of the underlying factors that are contributing to this?
The research points to a few key issues. One is that they have what's called a narrow tax base. So that means that many businesses and individuals are able to avoid paying taxes, which of course limits government revenue. There are also concerns about just inefficiencies in public spending and generally sluggish economic growth, which makes it harder to generate the income they need to pay off all those debts.
It's a complex problem with no easy solutions. And it really highlights how interconnected all of these economic issues are across a whole region. One country's debt problems can have a ripple effect on all of its neighbors, especially when you're talking about an economic bloc like the EU that's so integrated.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to something this is a topic that's close to my heart. Location, location, location. You have a paper here examining how different location factors influence business decisions, specifically in Slovakia. What makes a certain place really attractive for companies in that part of the world?
I'm always fascinated by what draws businesses to certain locations. Is it just about cheap labor and low taxes, or are there other factors that come into play?
Well, this research surveyed over 275 companies across Slovakia, and what they found was that the factors that were most important were actually things like access to a skilled workforce and being close to their target market. Of course, costs are always something to think about, but having the right people and being close to your customers seems to be more important than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense. You need talented people to build a successful business, and it's pretty hard to sell products or services if you're not located where your customers are. So were there any surprises in what they found?
Yeah, actually, there were a few. Things like land and natural resources and the overall environmental conditions were really only considered relevant by companies that operate in the primary sector, like agriculture and mining. For most other businesses, those factors weren't as influential as things like having good infrastructure and easy access to transportation networks.
So having a good, reliable road system is more important than a beautiful view. I guess that makes sense from a logistics standpoint.
It seems that way, at least in Slovakia. And it's interesting because the things related to law and socioeconomic conditions were basically considered irrelevant by most of the companies that they surveyed. It suggests that, at least in this particular context, businesses are prioritizing those really practical considerations over any political or social factors when deciding where to locate.
That's a really interesting insight into their decision-making process. It seems like companies are really laser-focused on what's going to make them operationally successful. Okay, let's talk about something a little more futuristic. Dynamic biometric signatures, or DBS. It sounds kind of like something you'd see in a spy movie.
It does, doesn't it? But It's becoming more and more relevant in our digital world. The research you provided explores how DBS can be used as a really secure way to verify someone's identity, especially when it comes to things like online transactions. Imagine it as like a digital fingerprint of your signature. It analyzes not just what your signature looks like, but how you actually write it, the pressure you apply, the speed of your strokes, all in real time.
So it's like a super high-tech version of those signature verification systems they use at the bank. But instead of comparing it to just a static image, it's analyzing the entire process of you signing your name.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so much harder to forge. It's capturing those unique individual characteristics that everyone has in their handwriting. The research argues that this technology could provide a level of security that's comparable to those traditional electronic signatures that rely on cryptography, while also being a more natural and intuitive way for people to sign documents online.
It sounds really promising, but I can also see some potential downsides. What about the privacy concerns? If my signature is being analyzed in such detail, couldn't that information be used for other purposes? Maybe even without me knowing about it.
That's a very valid concern, and the research does acknowledge the need for those really robust systems to protect biometric data. Just like we have safeguards in place for fingerprints and facial recognition data, similar measures would need to be implemented for DBS to ensure that this sensitive information is used responsibly and ethically.
It's good that they're thinking about those issues. It seems like with any new technology, there's always a trade-off between convenience and security. Now let's move on to something that's become more and more important in the business world. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR.
Ah, yes, CSR. It's gone from just being a buzzword to something that companies are really starting to take seriously. The research you provided explores CSR from a bunch of different angles, its impact on lifelong learning, to its role in strategic planning. But the overarching theme seems to be the shift towards a more holistic view of business, one that considers not just profits, but also the impact that businesses are having on people and the planet.
So it's not just about doing some good deeds on the side. It's about integrating those ethical considerations into how a business operates at its core.
Precisely. One of the sources actually presents a new management model. It combines social responsibility with sustainable development and the overall organizational function. And they argue that a business can only be considered truly socially responsible if it creates value in multiple areas: economic, ecological, and social, for a wide range of stakeholders.
It sounds like a more enlightened approach to business, recognizing that companies are part of a larger ecosystem and have a responsibility to contribute to its well-being.
Exactly. And it's not just about being altruistic. There's growing evidence that businesses that really prioritize CSR often end up performing better financially over the long run. Consumers are increasingly demanding ethical and sustainable practices, and investors are looking to put their money into companies that are managing those environmental, social, and governance (ESG) risks effectively.
So it's a win-win situation. Companies can do good and do well at the same time. Now let's turn our attention to the younger generation and some of the choices they're making. You have some research here about the decision-making process of young people in Slovakia when it comes to buying dairy products. Are they actually informed consumers, or are they driven more by impulse and habit?
That's the question this study tries to answer. They used both questionnaires and those focus group discussions with young people to really try to understand what motivates them, what influences them when they buy dairy products. And it was interesting because taste and habit emerged as the most significant factors driving their consumption, rather than health considerations or a deep understanding of the nutritional value of what they were buying.
So they're drawn to things that taste good and things that they're used to, rather than what's necessarily good for them, which isn't all that surprising, especially with younger people.
You're right. It's important to remember that, young people are still developing their understanding of nutrition and health, but the research also found that they do care a lot about taste and quality. They're not just grabbing the cheapest option on the shelf. They're willing to pay more for products that they feel meet their preferences.
That's a good insight. It seems like there's a real opportunity there for dairy producers to appeal to these younger consumers by focusing on both taste and health benefits.
Absolutely. Now, for something a little more, adventurous, you've included some material on revenue sharing projects, or rev share as it's often called. It seems like a potentially risky but also potentially lucrative way to invest.
Yes, this is something that caught my eye. I've heard a little bit about rev share, but to be honest, I'm not totally sure how it works. Is it kind of like crowdfunding, but for advertising?
In a way, yeah, you could say that. The research describes these projects as these online platforms where individuals can invest in different advertising packages and then share in the revenue that's generated from those ads. So they can offer the potential for high returns, but like any investment, there are risks.
So you're essentially betting on the success of those advertising campaigns, but if they don't perform well, you could lose your investment.
That's the risk. The research emphasizes how important it is to really understand the specific terms and conditions of any RevShare project before you invest. And they also caution against putting all your eggs in one basket. Diversification is key, and alternative investments like RevShare should probably only be a small portion of your overall investment portfolio.
It sounds like you really need to do your homework before jumping into something like this. Are there any regulations or any kind of oversight in this area to protect investors?
That's actually one of the challenges with RevShare. The research acknowledges that there's a lack of established regulations and oversight, which can make it difficult to assess how legitimate and how stable these projects actually are.
So buyer beware is the rule of thumb here. It sounds like you really need to be able to trust the platform and the people behind it.
Exactly. It's important to approach these projects with a healthy dose of skepticism, do your research, and really understand those risks before you put any money in. The potential for those high returns is, it's very attractive, but it's also crucial to remember that those high rewards often come with higher risks as well. Now, shifting gears again to something that's always near and dear to my heart, education.
Oh, yes, education. It's so important. It's really the foundation for a strong society. You have a paper here about strategic planning in different educational institutions, specifically focusing on high schools in Slovakia. So how are they adapting to our changing world?
Well, this research, it's based on a case study of a specific high school, and it really emphasizes how important strategic planning is for all educational institutions. They argue that schools need to be just as strategic and forward-thinking as any business if they really want to meet the needs of their students and the needs of the broader community.
So it's not just about teaching the same curriculum year after year. It's about constantly evaluating and adapting to make sure they're preparing their students for the future.
Exactly. This particular school used something called a SWOT analysis, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. They use this tool to look at everything, from their curriculum and facilities to even their relationships with parents and the surrounding community.
It's like they were approaching the school like it was a business, conducting a really thorough assessment to figure out where they could improve. Did they find anything surprising during this process?
They did. One really interesting thing they found was that, well, while the school was already excelling in certain areas, like spiritual education, they also realized they needed to do a better job of communicating upcoming events to parents, and that they needed to provide more opportunities for their students to engage in leisure activities. They even found out through student questionnaires that the students wanted more respect for their individuality, which I thought was pretty insightful.
It makes you think about how often we try to just fit all of our students into a standardized mold rather than really recognizing and nurturing their unique talents and interests.
And speaking of individual needs, we have a few sources here that explore the concept of quality of life, or QOL. It seems like such a subjective and even elusive idea to define.
It really is, and the research you provided kind of reflects that. There's no single definition of what constitutes a good quality of life because it depends on so many factors, and it really does vary from person to person. But the interesting thing is that this research emphasizes the need to consider what they call spatial variations, meaning what makes for a high QOL in one city or region might be totally different in another place.
That makes sense. What works in a huge bustling metropolis might not work in a small rural village. So what are some of those key factors that they identify that seem to contribute to a high QOL, regardless of location? They looked at a really wide range of factors, from the classic economic indicators like income and employment to more nuanced things like, access to quality healthcare, having a clean and healthy environment to live in, and also having opportunities for social interaction and cultural engagement. It's a reminder that a truly livable place needs to cater to all of the diverse needs of its people.
It sounds like achieving a high quality of life is like this balancing act, weighing all those different priorities and finding solutions that benefit the majority while also recognizing and respecting individual preferences.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears and talk about something we all face in our lives, both our personal and professional lives, whether we like it or not: risk. You included a paper exploring all the different approaches to risk management in today's complex business world. It's always a relevant topic, but maybe even more so in these uncertain times.
Definitely. I mean, we're constantly hearing news about economic ups and downs, geopolitical tensions, and all these emerging technologies that are disrupting entire industries. It can feel a little bit overwhelming, like we're constantly living on the edge. So I'm curious, what are some of the key takeaways from this research? How are companies trying to mitigate all of these ever-present threats?
Well, this paper highlights three main systems that companies are using to deal with risk: GRC, and CRAM.
I have to admit, I'm not familiar with those acronyms. Could you break those down for me?
Of course. stands for Enterprise Risk Management. GRC stands for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. And CRAM is the CCTA Risk Analysis and Management Method. Each system has its own nuances and advantages, but they all share a common goal: to identify, assess, and mitigate potential threats in a structured and systematic way.
So it's not about just trying to avoid risk altogether, which is, well, probably impossible in today's world, but about having a solid strategy to manage it effectively.
Precisely. The research highlights several benefits of implementing these types of risk management systems. For example, you get a more comprehensive view of risks across the entire organization. You can make better decisions. You become more efficient and effective in terms of managing your compliance with different regulations. And in the end, you have a stronger and more resilient company.
So in a way, having a proactive approach to risk management can actually turn potential threats into opportunities to grow and improve.
Exactly. It's about being prepared, having that plan, and being able to adapt and respond to any challenges in a timely and effective way.
That's reassuring. It makes me feel like I have at least a little bit more control over all of those unpredictable forces that are swirling around us.
Well, control is maybe a bit too strong a word. It's more about awareness, preparation, and that ability to navigate any uncertainty that you're faced with confidently.
I like that. Now, let's talk about an asset that's often overlooked, but it's absolutely crucial to economic success: human capital. You included a paper that examines how important it is in driving national competitiveness, and it's something we often hear about, but I'm curious to delve deeper into what it actually means and why it's so important.
Well, this research really emphasizes how important it is to invest in education, training, and really developing a skilled workforce. They argue that countries that have a high level of human capital are just better equipped to adapt to all of these technological advancements, drive innovation, and compete in our increasingly globalized economy. It's all about having people who have the skills and the knowledge to thrive in a knowledge-based economy, which is what we have today.
So it's not just about having a large workforce, but about having a workforce that's prepared to handle the challenges and all those new opportunities of the 21st century.
Precisely. The research goes into this concept of technological modes and how transitions to new modes, like the one we're going through right now, with all of the digital technologies that are emerging, require a workforce that can adapt and learn new skills very quickly. And the countries that fail to really invest in their people are the ones that are at risk of falling behind.
Yeah, it's a reminder that a nation's people are really its most valuable asset, and that investing in their education and development is essential for long-term prosperity. Now, I'm excited about this next topic. You included a source that traces the evolution of economic thought all the way from those ancient Greek philosophers to modern-day thinkers. It's a fascinating journey through time, just exploring how our understanding of economics has changed over the centuries.
It is a fascinating journey. It's really amazing to see how these ideas about wealth, production, and human behavior have evolved over time. And all of them have been shaped by the intellectual trends of each era and the challenges that those societies faced. It reminds you that economics is not some static field. It's a constantly evolving body of knowledge that's always being challenged and refined.
So where does this journey actually begin? What were the ancient Greeks thinking about when it came to economics?
Well, thinkers back then, like Aristotle and Xenophon, they were already trying to figure out concepts like value, trade, and what role the state should play in economic affairs. They were pondering questions like the nature of money, the ethics of commerce, and even how wealth should be distributed. You could say they were really laying the foundation for the field of economics as we know it today.
It's incredible to think that these ideas have been debated for centuries, and they're still relevant to many of the challenges that we face today. So what are some of the key milestones in the development of economic thought that really stand out to you?
Well, the research highlights a few really pivotal moments. You have the mercantilists who emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, who were all about accumulating wealth through things like trade surpluses and strong government intervention in the economy. Then, in the 18th century, you have the physiocrats who believed that land was the ultimate source of wealth and argued for a more hands-off approach from the government. And of course, you can't forget the classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They were the ones who really developed those theories of free markets, the division of labor, and comparative advantage ideas that are still really influential today.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that our understanding of economics is constantly changing, always being shaped by those intellectual currents of the time and the challenges that each society is facing.
Precisely. And as you move into the 19th and 20th centuries, you see these new schools of thought emerging, like Marxism, Keynesian economics, and the Chicago School, each with their own unique perspective on how economies work and how they can best be managed. It's a rich tapestry of ideas, and it's fascinating to see how they've influenced economic policies and how they've shaped the world we live in today.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there are multiple ways of looking at economic issues, and that it's important to consider those different viewpoints to really get a more complete understanding of just how complex the world really is.
Absolutely. Now, let's shift our focus from the grand sweep of history to the financial health of individual companies. You have a paper here that talks about financial analysis and how important it is in assessing a company's performance and its overall prospects. It's a topic that can seem a little daunting to some people, but it's really essential for anyone who wants to understand how businesses work and how to make those informed investment decisions.
Yeah, I agree. I've always been a little bit intimidated by financial statements, but I know they hold those valuable clues about a company's health. Can you break it down for me? What are some of those key tools and techniques that analysts are using to make sense of all those numbers?
This paper dives into the world of financial analysis, and it explains all sorts of different tools that are used, like ratio analysis, trend analysis, and different forecasting methods. They even give you a practical example using some real financial data from a company called INDOA International Inc. to show you how these tools can actually be applied.
So it's about using those numbers to tell a story about a company's performance and maybe even its potential.
Exactly. They really emphasize how important it is to analyze financial data in context. So you have to consider things like industry trends, the overall economic conditions, and also the company's competitive landscape.
So it's not just about looking at the numbers in isolation. It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Precisely. And the paper also points out the limitations of financial analysis, acknowledging that it's really just one piece of the puzzle when you're trying to assess a company's performance and its potential. You have to consider all sorts of other factors, the quality of its management, the strength of its brand, and the overall pace of technological innovation. All of those things can play a significant role in determining a company's success or failure.
It's a reminder that numbers can tell you a story,
Yeah.
but it's important to really understand the full narrative and all of the context and nuances before making any kind of judgment.
Absolutely. Now, let's shift our focus to a sector that, often flies under the radar, but plays such a vital role in our communities, nonprofit organizations. You included some research that looks at trends in their numbers and activities, specifically in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, I'm curious about this. I know that nonprofits do a lot of important work, but they often struggle for funding and they don't always get the recognition that they deserve. So what's the overall picture in the Czech Republic?
Well, this research highlights all of the significant contributions that nonprofit organizations make to society, addressing all sorts of social needs, promoting civic engagement, and just fostering a sense of community. They analyze data from a variety of different nonprofits, including those charitable foundations, endowment funds, civil associations, and even those community interest societies.
So they're really essential for a healthy and vibrant society.
They absolutely are. And the research actually reveals some interesting trends. For instance, there's been a decline in the number of foundations and endowment funds, which is a bit surprising considering that the Czech Republic recently made it easier for these types of organizations to operate.
Yeah, that is surprising. What do they attribute that decline to?
Well, they suggest that it might be due to things like funding challenges and maybe increased competition from other types of organizations. It really just highlights the fact that even though the legal environment might be more favorable now, nonprofits still face significant hurdles in terms of securing those resources and just navigating a very competitive landscape.
It's a reminder that the nonprofit sector isn't immune to all of those economic pressures and all the changes that happen in the political and social environment.
Exactly. Now, let's move on to a topic that people often associate with failure, but it's actually an essential part of the overall economic cycle: insolvency. You included some research that compares insolvency procedures in, get this, 88 countries around the world.
Yeah, that one caught my eye because, I don't know, I've always been curious about how different countries handle business failures.
Is there like a best approach or does it vary a lot?
Well, that's exactly what this research tries to figure out. They use this standardized case study to compare all sorts of things: the time it takes, the cost, and even the recovery rates for creditors in all those different countries. And what they found is that, there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to dealing with insolvency. The effectiveness and efficiency of those systems, they vary quite a bit depending on different regions and different income levels.
So what are some of those key factors that really influence how well a country's insolvency system works?
Well, they found that the countries that have those clear, predictable, and efficient insolvency procedures tend to have those higher recovery rates for creditors. It takes less time to resolve cases, and the overall cost is lower. It seems like those systems strike a balance between protecting the creditors and also giving those struggling businesses a fair shot to either restructure or just exit the market in a more orderly way.
Yeah, it seems like having a well-functioning insolvency system is really crucial for a healthy economy. It kind of allows for that creative destruction where those failing businesses can be replaced with new ventures while also minimizing the negative impact on the creditors and the economy as a whole.
Exactly. Now let's talk about something that's often used to try to help those small businesses: credit guarantees. You included a paper examining how they can be used to stimulate economic activity.
Yeah, and this is actually something I've always been a little bit fuzzy on. Can you explain how those credit guarantees actually work and why they're considered so important?
So basically, credit guarantees are like promises that are made by a third party, often a government agency or a special financial institution, to cover part of a loan if the person borrowing the money ends up defaulting. And this can encourage lenders to lend money to those small businesses that might have a hard time getting financing, either because they don't have enough collateral or maybe they just don't have a very long credit history.
So it's a way of reducing the risk for those lenders and making them more willing to support those small businesses.
Exactly. The research highlights all of the potential benefits of those credit guarantees. They include things like increased access to credit for those small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs. They help to boost entrepreneurship, create more jobs, and just generally stimulate economic growth. They also talk about the challenges involved in designing and implementing those credit guarantee schemes, making sure you strike that balance between mitigating the risk for the lenders, but also at the same time, you're trying to expand access to credit for those borrowers that really deserve it.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act, finding the right incentives and safeguards for both the lenders and the people who are borrowing the money.
Absolutely. Now, let's switch to a topic that's getting more and more attention, social innovation. You have some research exploring the factors that contribute to its success in different regions of the Czech Republic.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this. Social innovation seems to be like the big buzzword these days. Can you explain what it really means and what makes it successful?
Well, social innovation is all about developing and implementing new solutions to those social challenges, to create positive social change. So it's about finding creative and effective ways to tackle things like poverty, inequality, all those environmental problems, and other social issues. And this research, it analyzes data from different regions of the Czech Republic, trying to see what factors contribute to the success of those different social innovation initiatives.
So it's not just about coming up with good ideas, it's about actually putting those ideas into action and making a real difference.
Exactly. And what they found is that collaboration, stakeholder engagement, and having a really supportive ecosystem are all absolutely crucial for those social innovation initiatives to be successful. The successful initiatives often involve partnerships between government agencies, those nonprofit organizations, businesses, and community members, all working together towards a common goal.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these complex social challenges, they really do require solutions where everyone works together, and that sometimes innovation can come from those really unexpected sources.
Absolutely. Now let's look at a trend that's been gaining a lot of traction. The rise of all of those vegan products.
Yeah.
You have some research examining how private label brands are responding to this shift in consumer preferences.
Yeah, this is something I've noticed in my own shopping habits. It seems like there are so many more vegan options these days, even from those store brands. So what's really driving this trend?
Well, this particular research looks specifically at the private label brand Take It Veggie, which was launched by the retail giant Kaufland in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. They're analyzing consumer behavior and preferences towards those vegan products, and they're using data from things like questionnaires and focus group discussions. And what they found is that there's a growing acceptance of those vegan options, especially among younger generations, who are becoming more aware of all of the environmental and ethical implications of their food choices. And also they're concerned about animal welfare and even interested in the perceived health benefits of those plant-based diets. It's all contributing to a growing demand for vegan options.
And those private label brands, like the Take It Veggie brand, are stepping up to meet that demand, making those options more accessible and affordable for everyone. It's interesting how those brands can really influence consumer trends, isn't it?
Absolutely. They play a key role in shaping the market. Now, to wrap up this whirlwind tour of your sources, we come to a topic that's, well, it's as relevant today as it was, centuries ago. Strategic planning. You included a source that traces the evolution of strategic thinking from those ancient military strategies to those modern business applications.
Ah, yes, those timeless principles of strategy. It's fascinating to think that we can actually learn from those ancient military commanders like Sun Tzu and apply those lessons to the challenges we face in the business world today.
This research really does highlight that connection, drawing all those parallels between the strategic thinking of those ancient military minds and the approaches that modern businesses use to navigate those complex and competitive environments. It really emphasizes the importance of having a very clear understanding of your goals, your resources, and all those potential risks and obstacles that you might have to face.
So it's not just about charging ahead without any plan. It's about having a strategy, anticipating challenges, and being ready to adapt to all of those changing circumstances.
Exactly. They really emphasize that flexibility, the ability to adjust your strategy as you go based on new information or those unexpected events. It's about being proactive, not reactive.
It makes you think about all of those ancient military commanders and how they had to make those life or death decisions based on, incomplete information and constantly shifting battlefields. Those skills are still totally relevant today, even if the stakes aren't always quite as high.
Absolutely. And the research really emphasizes that importance of learning from those historical examples, both the successes and the failures. By studying how others have approached those strategic challenges in the past, we can gain all of these really valuable insights that can inform our own decision-making in the present.
It's like having a playbook full of strategies that have been tested and refined over centuries of human experience.
Exactly. Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to something we mentioned earlier, the idea of cities as those reproductive systems. We talked about the importance of sustainability and creating those urban environments that can really thrive over time. But doesn't this concept also suggest that there are limits to growth?
That's a great question. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but yeah, you're right. If a city is like a living organism, it can't just grow forever without any consequences.
Right. The paper we discussed does acknowledge that tension between growth and sustainability. It argues that for cities to truly function as those reproductive systems, they need to figure out how to balance economic development with environmental protection and social well-being.
So it's not just about building more skyscrapers and just expanding outwards. It's about creating those denser, more integrated urban environments that really prioritize quality of life and try to minimize their impact on the surrounding ecosystem.
Exactly. And this kind of connects to another theme that we've been talking about, the importance of location for businesses.
Yeah.
If cities become too crowded, too polluted, or just too expensive, they might start to become less attractive to businesses and residents as well.
Yeah, it's like this delicate ecosystem. You have to find that balance, that sweet spot where economic activity can really flourish, but without compromising the overall quality of life or the health of the environment.
Precisely. And this brings us back to the whole role of strategic planning. Cities, just like businesses, need to have a long-term vision, a solid plan for how they want to grow and evolve, while also considering all of those potential risks and challenges.
It seems like having that strategic mindset is essential at all levels, from individual businesses to entire cities and even whole nations. We're all trying to navigate this complex and constantly changing world. And having a plan, even if it's a flexible plan, can help us to make better decisions and hopefully achieve better outcomes.
Absolutely. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and revisit the topic of SMEs. We talked about how important they are to those European economies and the EU's emphasis on that think small first principle. But I'm curious, what are some of those specific challenges that SMEs face, especially in a world that's changing so quickly?
Well, I imagine that one of the biggest challenges for them is just staying competitive in a global marketplace. They're often going up against those larger, more established companies that have a lot more resources and those economies of scale.
Yeah, that's definitely a key challenge. And the research you provided highlights some other hurdles as well, like getting access to financing, trying to navigate all of those complex regulations, and attracting and keeping skilled employees.
It sounds like a never-ending uphill battle for those smaller businesses.
It can be, but the research also points out the resilience and the adaptability of SMEs. They're often much more agile and innovative than those bigger companies, and they really do play a crucial role in driving economic growth and creating new jobs.
So it's really important that we support those smaller businesses, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of the whole economy.
Exactly, and this kind of connects to something we discussed earlier, the role of those credit guarantees in helping SMEs to get access to financing. By By reducing that risk for the lenders, those guarantees can really help smaller businesses to get the capital they need to grow and thrive.
It's like a bridge that helps to connect those who have the capital with those who really need it, which helps to foster more entrepreneurship and economic growth. Now let's turn our attention back to Russia. We talked about how the country's move to a floating exchange rate helped them to kind of weather those storms of the volatile oil market. But I'm curious, what are some of those other challenges facing the Russian economy?
Well, in addition to that constant volatility in energy prices, the research that you gave us highlights some other issues, such as some structural weaknesses in the economy, a lack of diversification, and those ongoing geopolitical tensions, which can impact investment and overall economic growth.
It sounds like a really complex and challenging environment to have to navigate.
It really does. And it reminds you that economic performance is influenced by so many factors, both those internal and those external factors as well.
Speaking of those external factors, let's revisit that topic of visual merchandising and its impact on consumer behavior. We talked about all those subtle ways that retailers try to influence our decisions through store design, lighting, music, and even scent. But doesn't that raise some ethical questions? I mean, is it really fair to try to manipulate consumers in those ways?
That's a good question. And it's one that's being debated more and more as people become aware of the psychology behind marketing and advertising. Some argue that as long as retailers are being honest about their practices and not using deceptive tactics, there's nothing really wrong with trying to create a really appealing and engaging shopping experience. But others argue that these techniques can exploit those subconscious biases that we all have and make us buy things that we might not otherwise buy if we were thinking a little more rationally.
Yeah, it's kind of a blurry line, isn't it? Where does persuasion end and manipulation begin?
It's a complicated issue without any easy answers, but it's definitely something worth considering as we navigate this world of marketing and advertising that's becoming more and more sophisticated.
Now, let's shift our focus to the younger generation again. We talked about how taste and habit seem to be those big drivers in their consumption of dairy products. But I'm curious, what about those other factors like price and convenience? Are those important considerations for young consumers as well?
Absolutely. The research that you provided found that price and convenience play a huge role in those young people's purchasing decisions. They're often on a much tighter budget than older consumers, and they really value products that are easy to find, easy to prepare, and easy to consume.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're busy juggling school, maybe work, and all of their social lives. They don't have a lot of time or money to waste.
Exactly. And this really highlights an opportunity for those food producers and retailers to appeal to this younger demographic. By offering products that are affordable, convenient, and also tasty. They can really capture a significant part of this growing market.
It's a good reminder that understanding the needs and preferences of your target audience is absolutely crucial for success in any business, but especially in that super competitive food industry.
Absolutely. Now, let's circle back to that topic of education. We talked about how those high schools in Slovakia are using strategic planning to adapt to the changing world. But I'm curious, what are some of those specific changes that they're making? What does this adaptation actually look like in practice?
Well, the case study you provided mentions a few key areas that they're focusing on. One is updating the curriculum to better reflect what people need in the 21st century workforce, with more emphasis on things like digital skills, critical thinking, and problem solving.
That makes sense. I mean, the world is changing so fast,
Yeah.
and schools need to make sure that their students are ready to succeed in this new environment when they graduate.
Right. They're also putting a lot of effort into improving their facilities and their technology to create those more engaging and interactive learning environments.
It sounds like they're really trying to create a more modern and a more relevant educational experience for their students.
They are, and they're also focusing on building those stronger relationships with parents and the surrounding community. They're realizing that education isn't just about what happens inside of the classroom. It's about creating this whole learning environment that involves the whole community.
That's a good point. It really does take a village to raise a child and a whole community to educate them well.
Exactly. Now, let's go back into that world of finance and revisit that topic of financial analysis. We talked about how it can be used to kind of assess a company's overall health and its prospects, but I'm curious, are there any specific ratios or indicators that analysts really pay attention to?
Well, there are a lot of different ratios and indicators that analysts use, but some of the most common ones include things like liquidity ratios, which measure a company's ability to meet those short-term financial obligations. There are profitability ratios, which look at how efficiently a company is generating profits, and also solvency ratios, which look at the company's long-term financial stability.
So it's kind of like giving a company a financial checkup. You're looking at all the different aspects of its financial health to get a more holistic picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by comparing these ratios over time and against the industry benchmarks, analysts can get a better understanding of a company's performance trends, its strengths and weaknesses, and its potential for future growth.
It's like a financial detective story. You're using those clues and those patterns to piece together a narrative about the company's financial health and its future.
I like that analogy. It's about looking beyond just those raw numbers and understanding the story that they're telling.
Now, let's shift our focus to the nonprofit sector again. We talked about the challenges that they're facing in the Czech Republic, including things like those funding constraints and competition from other organizations. But I'm curious, what are some of the specific strategies that those nonprofits are using to adapt and thrive in this type of environment?
Well, the research that you provided highlights a few key strategies that they're using. One is diversifying their funding sources.
Yeah.
Instead of relying just on government grants or private donations, they're looking into new avenues like social enterprise ventures, crowdfunding campaigns, and even partnerships with businesses.
So they're becoming more entrepreneurial in their approach to getting funding.
Exactly. And they're also focusing on building those stronger relationships with their stakeholders, including their donors, volunteers, those who benefit from their services, and just the wider community. They're realizing how important it is to be transparent, accountable, and to show that they're making an impact so that they can build trust and attract more support.
It seems like they're having to become more sophisticated in their operations and their marketing to be able to compete.
They are. And they're also using more technology to streamline their operations, reach new audiences, and measure their impact in a more effective way.
It's encouraging to see how those nonprofits are innovating and adapting to meet those challenges. Their work is just so crucial to a healthy and vibrant society.
Absolutely. Now, let's go back to the topic of insolvency one last time. We talked about how different countries deal with business failures, but I'm curious, what are some of the key lessons that we can learn from all those different approaches?
Well, one of the key takeaways from the research is that having an insolvency system that's clear, predictable, and efficient is crucial for having a healthy economy. It allows for that orderly resolution of those business failures, minimizes the negative impact on those creditors and the overall economy, and it really encourages more entrepreneurship and innovation by reducing that fear of failure.
That's a great point. It's about creating a system that balances the interests of all of the stakeholders and recognizes that business failures are just an inevitable part of the economic cycle.
Right. And it's not about just punishing those failures. It's about providing those opportunities for struggling businesses to restructure, to reorganize, or to just exit the market in a way that minimizes the harm and maximizes the value for everyone involved.
Exactly. It's about creating a more resilient and dynamic economy that can adapt to change and foster that long-term growth.
Now, let's talk about those credit guarantees again. We discussed how they can help those SMEs to get that financing, but I'm curious, what are some of the potential downsides or risks associated with those guarantees?
Well, one of the biggest risks is that they can create what's called moral hazard. That's where borrowers might be tempted to take on more risk than they normally would if they knew that they wouldn't be fully responsible for that debt.
So it's like having a safety net that might encourage some borrowers to take on more risk than they can actually handle.
Exactly. And there's also the risk of what they call adverse selection, which is where lenders might be more likely to give money to riskier borrowers if they know that that part of that loan is guaranteed.
So it's another one of those balancing acts. You want to make credit more accessible for those deserving borrowers, but you also don't want to create a system that encourages reckless lending or reckless borrowing.
Precisely. It's a challenge that policymakers and those financial institutions really have to think about when they're designing and implementing those credit guarantee schemes.
Now let's turn our attention back to social innovation. We talked about the importance of collaboration and stakeholder engagement for it to be successful. But I'm curious, are there any specific examples of successful social innovation initiatives that stand out to you?
Well, the research that you provided actually highlights a few really interesting examples from the Czech Republic. One is a community-owned wind farm that provides renewable energy and generates income for those local residents.
That's a great example of how social innovation can address both environmental and economic challenges.
Exactly. And another example is a social enterprise that provides training and employment opportunities for people with disabilities, helping them gain valuable skills and integrate into the workforce.
It's inspiring to see how those initiatives are making a real difference in people's lives while also promoting social and environmental sustainability.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that innovation can really come from anywhere, and that by working together we can create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world for everyone.
Now, let's revisit the topic of vegan products one last time. We talked about the growing demand for those plant-based options, but I'm curious, what are some of the challenges facing this industry? What hurdles do they have to overcome to really achieve mainstream adoption?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is just overcoming that perception that vegan food is bland, boring, or just too expensive. There's a lot of innovation happening in the plant-based food industry with companies developing those really delicious and affordable alternatives to meat, dairy, and eggs. But they need to do a better job of letting consumers know about all of those benefits.
So it's about changing people's hearts and minds as much as it is about developing those great products.
Exactly. Another challenge is making sure that those products are available to everyone. Plant-based options are often more expensive than those more conventional options, which can be a problem for those lower-income consumers.
So affordability is key if they want to reach a really large audience.
Absolutely. And then there's that challenge of just scaling up production to meet that growing demand. As more people switch to those plant-based diets, the industry needs to be able to produce enough food to meet that demand without compromising on quality or sustainability.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, but also a lot of opportunity for growth and innovation in this sector.
Absolutely. It's an exciting time to be watching the plant-based food industry, and I'm curious to see how it'll continue to evolve in the years to come.
Now, let's go back to that topic of strategic planning and how relevant it is to the modern world. We talked about the lessons we can learn from those ancient military strategies, but I'm curious, what are some of the specific ways that businesses are actually applying these principles today?
Well, one of those key applications is in what they call scenario planning, where businesses will develop different strategies for all sorts of potential futures.
So it's like having a plan A, a plan B, and maybe even a plan C, just depending on how things turn out.
Exactly. It helps those businesses to anticipate challenges, identify potential risks and opportunities, and just be more adaptable when faced with uncertainty. Another key application is in competitive analysis, where businesses will use strategic thinking to understand their competitors' strengths and weaknesses, identify their own advantages, and develop strategies to gain market share.
Yeah. It sounds like a never-ending game of chess, always trying to anticipate your opponent's moves and position yourself for success.
Yeah, exactly. And just like in chess, that strategic thinking is essential for winning the game.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one last theme that emerged from our exploration. The importance of lifelong learning in a world that's changing so quickly.
That's a really crucial point. I mean, the world's changing faster than ever before, driven by technology, globalization, and shifting demographics. To really thrive in this environment, we need to be constantly learning, adapting, and expanding our skills.
So it's not just about what we learn in school or university. It's about really developing that that mindset of continuous learning and growth throughout our lives.
Exactly. And this really connects to many of those topics we've discussed, from the importance of human capital for national competitiveness to the need for businesses to invest in their employees' development.
Right. The more we learn, the more adaptable and resilient we become, and the better prepared we'll be to navigate those challenges and seize all of those opportunities that lie ahead.
Absolutely. Lifelong learning isn't a luxury anymore. It's really a necessity for success in the 21st century.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've covered such a vast landscape of ideas and insights. We've explored how cities work, the challenges facing those SMEs, the complexities of financial analysis, the evolving landscape of education, and so much more.
It's been a real pleasure exploring all of these topics with you. The sheer breadth and depth of all of the sources that you provided is a testament to your curiosity and your thirst for knowledge.
Well, I'm always eager to learn new things and expand my understanding of the world. And diving into all of these sources with you has been a truly enlightening experience.
I feel the same way. It's been such a stimulating and thought-provoking conversation, and I've really enjoyed sharing my insights and perspectives with you.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. How can we as a society ensure that economic growth and development benefits everyone, not just a select few? It's a question that's been at the heart of so much of what we've talked about today, and it's one that we'll continue to explore in the final part of our journey.
It's a fundamental question,
Yeah.
and one that requires us to really think critically about our economic systems, our values, and our priorities.
Stay tuned for part 3 of our deep dive into European business and economics, where we'll delve even deeper into this question and explore some potential solutions.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into European business and economics. You know, we've covered a lot of ground exploring everything from how to make cities more sustainable to the growing popularity of those vegan products. But as we kind of wrap up this journey, I want to circle back to a question that's been on my mind. How can we make sure that economic growth and development benefits everyone, not just a small select group?
It's a question that's really at the core of a lot of what we've been talking about. You know, we've seen examples of different policies and initiatives that are aimed at helping those SMEs, promoting social innovation and creating more equitable economic opportunities. But there's always more that can be done.
You're right. We talked about the EU's Think Small First principle, which encourages those policymakers to really consider the impact of their decisions on those smaller businesses.
Yeah.
But beyond just policy, are there other things we can do to create a more level playing field for those SMEs, especially when they're competing with those much larger, more established companies?
One approach that seems to be gaining some traction is fostering those collaborations and networks among SMEs. So by working together, they can share resources, knowledge, and even their access to markets, giving them a collective advantage that they wouldn't have on their own.
So it's about strength in numbers, kind of creating a supportive ecosystem where those smaller businesses can really thrive. I like that. Now, we also talked about how important it is to invest in human capital, education, training, and just developing a skilled workforce. But I'm curious, are there other ways, beyond those traditional education systems to encourage people to keep learning throughout their lives and make sure they have the skills they need to adapt to this rapidly changing world?
One area that's really showing a lot of promise is online learning. You know, those massive open online courses, the MOCs, they're offering this huge variety of courses and learning resources, often for free or very cheaply, which is making education more accessible to people all over the world.
It's incredible how technology is really changing how we access knowledge and creating these new pathways for learning and development.
It really is. And beyond formal education, I think it's important to create a culture of continuous learning within those organizations and within communities. You know, encouraging things like those mentoring programs, peer-to-peer learning, and giving employees those opportunities to attend conferences and workshops. All of that can help to create a more dynamic and adaptable workforce.
Yeah, it's about fostering that curiosity and that desire to learn and grow throughout our lives. Now, shifting gears a bit, we talked about those vegan products and the growing demand for plant-based options. But I'm wondering, beyond those personal dietary choices, what role can businesses play in promoting those those more sustainable and ethical food systems?
Well, one really important step is just reducing food waste. It's estimated that a third of all the food that's produced globally ends up being wasted, which is it's a huge environmental and economic burden. Businesses can implement strategies to minimize waste throughout that whole supply chain, from production all the way to retail.
That makes sense. Every little bit helps.
Yeah.
But beyond just reducing waste, are there other ways businesses can help to create a more sustainable food system?
Absolutely. Supporting local and regional food systems is another important step. This can involve sourcing those ingredients from local farmers, which reduces transportation costs and emissions and helps to promote those regional culinary traditions.
So it's about connecting those consumers with the people who are growing their food, building those stronger communities, and reducing our overall environmental footprint.
Exactly. And there's also a growing interest in regenerative agriculture, which really focuses on those practices that improve soil health, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration. Businesses can play a role here by supporting those farmers who are adopting these types of practices, which will help to create more demand for those more sustainably produced foods.
It's really encouraging to see all of these new innovative approaches emerging in the food industry. Now, we've talked a lot about those challenges facing those European economies, those debt levels, the economic volatility, and the need for some structural reforms. But amidst all of these challenges, are there any bright spots? Any reasons to be optimistic?
Of course, absolutely. One positive trend is the growing recognition of how important sustainability and social responsibility really are. We're seeing this reflected in consumer preferences and in those investor decisions and even in those government policies. There's a growing awareness that economic growth can't come at the expense of the environment or social well-being.
So it's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where economic prosperity can go hand in hand with environmental sustainability and social justice.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we're seeing so much innovation and creativity in this space. Businesses, governments, and individuals, they're all working together to develop these new models for a more sustainable and equitable future.
That's really inspiring. It gives me hope that we can create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier. The importance of critical thinking in a world that's just overflowing with information. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with data, opinions, and often just conflicting perspectives on those economic issues. So how do we navigate all of this and really make sense of it all?
It's definitely a challenge we all face. One key skill is just being aware of our own biases. Those preconceived notions that we all have. By acknowledging those biases, we can start to question our own assumptions and just be more open to those different perspectives.
So it's about having humility, recognizing that we don't have all of the answers and that we can always learn more.
Exactly. And it's about developing that critical lens, that ability to really evaluate information, to question those sources and to separate fact from fiction. It's about being active learners, not just, passively consuming information.
It's about being engaged citizens,
yeah.
Those informed decision makers and just thoughtful participants in those economic and social discussions.
Precisely. It's about really taking ownership of how we understand the world and recognizing that knowledge really is power.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey of exploration, and I hope our listeners have found it as insightful as we have. We've uncovered all of those hidden connections, challenged those assumptions, and hopefully sparked some new ideas.
It's been such a pleasure sharing this journey with you. The variety of sources you provided and the depth of your questions have made this a really stimulating and thought-provoking experience for me.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into European business and economics. We've just scratched the surface, but I hope we've inspired you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with all of the forces that are shaping our world.
And remember, that journey of learning never truly ends. So stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.